I wasn't injured in Vietnam. I never even went. With that one sentence, Frank Washington shattered a lie he'd carried for over 45 years. But what was he hiding instead? This isn't just a story about a veteran with a mysterious wound. It's about identity, memory, and something far beyond human. If you love powerful, true-style stories that leave you thinking long after the credits roll, hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because this one might change how you see everything. The scissors clattered against the sterile floor, bouncing once before coming to rest beside the attending's shoe. Nobody moved. In the brightly lit operating room of Phoenix General Hospital, the temperature wasn't what made the air feel cold. It was what they had just uncovered. The senior resident's hands, still gloved and trembling, were frozen in mid-air, inches from the wound. He'd only peeled back 3 layers of Frank Washington's bandages. His eyes flicked to the attending physician, Dr. Martinez, who had gone utterly silent. "What is that?" someone whispered. The silence that followed was a scream. Dr. Patricia Martinez, 20 years in trauma surgery and seasoned, beyond shock, pressed one gloved hand against the wall for balance. She had seen gunshot wounds, car crashes, even battlefield amputations. But this was something different, something that shouldn't exist. Instead of rot and decay, the leg beneath the bandages appeared to have formed a dense web of scar tissue, sinew, and impossibly vascular channels that had no anatomical precedent. Thick, pale fibers spiraled like tree roots encasing the thigh and calf, with what appeared to be self-regulating cysts pulsing in rhythm with Frank's heartbeat. "It's not infected," Dr. Martinez said slowly, not trusting her voice. "It's contained." The young nurse beside her stepped back 2 full paces. "Should I call the pathology team?" Her voice cracked. "Or the CDC?" Dr. Martinez tore her gaze away from the wound. "Call both. And get me his full file, now." Someone bolted from the room. Meanwhile, down the hallway, in the surgical waiting area, Dorothy Washington sat with her purse clutched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She stared at the beige tile floor, counting the squares as if that might steady her heartbeat. She didn't cry. Dorothy didn't cry, not even when her parents died. But something was wrong, deeply wrong. She felt it in her bones. She had found Frank lying on the ground that morning near the back fence, lips pale, sweat soaking through his flannel shirt despite the cool Arizona air. He had waved her off, insisting it was just a pulled muscle. But Dorothy had seen the look in his eyes. Fear, real fear. Now, as doctors whispered behind closed doors, she gripped the tiny wooden cross in her pocket, carved by Frank decades ago, and wondered if she had ever truly known the man she married. 1 hour earlier, the sun had risen like it always did in Phoenix, casting long shadows across the beige stucco homes of their modest neighborhood. Birds chirped half-heartedly, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed to life. Inside the Washington home, the smell of burnt toast lingered in the air, a casualty of Frank's insistence on making breakfast without his reading glasses. He grunted softly as he shifted his weight from one leg to the other, trying not to grimace as he poured his coffee. He liked it black, strong enough to melt rust, as he always said. Frank eased into his recliner by the window, the old leather chair groaning under his weight like a ship in the harbor. He reached for the Arizona Republic, unfolded it with the same precision he had used for over 30 years, and settled into the quiet. The world, at least this morning, was still turning. From outside, the mailbox flag waved in the breeze like a small red salute. Frank eyed it and sighed. He would have to walk out there again. The limp wasn't new. It had been there longer than the digital clock on the microwave, longer than the recliner, longer than Samuel's entire medical career. It had simply become part of him. Every step was a reminder, a whisper in the bone. "You're not whole. You never were." But Frank never complained. Complaining was for people who didn't understand how lucky they were just to be alive. He stood with a soft grunt and walked toward the front door, favoring his right side. Dorothy watched him from the kitchen as she folded laundry. A lifetime of reading between the lines had taught her to see what others missed. She noticed the tightness in his jaw, the careful way he lowered himself into chairs, the way he winced when the weather changed. She had asked, once years ago, about the leg. "Old wound," he had said. "Doesn't need poking at." So she had let it be. Outside, Frank walked slowly to the mailbox, passing the flagpole where he raised the stars and stripes every morning without fail. His neighbors, like Betty Henderson next door, saw him as the picture of quiet American resilience. He had fixed Mrs. Peterson's dishwasher last fall, helped the Morales boy build a treehouse 2 summers ago. Everyone knew Frank. Everyone respected him, and none of them knew the truth. Inside the workshop, hidden behind racks of tools and rusted bolts, were cabinets, filled with bandages, gauze, sterile wipes, and creams not covered by Medicare. A notebook, yellowed at the edges, contained 3 decades worth of notes, measurements, diagrams, symptoms. He had mapped his leg's evolution like a scientist observing a foreign organism. Frank was meticulous, disciplined, but none of that had prepared him for what he saw in the mirror last week. The growth had changed. It pulsed now, slightly, responded to pressure, and when he pressed too hard, it felt aware. He hadn't told Dorothy. He never told Dorothy. She had enough to worry about. Later that morning, after the mailbox and the coffee and the newspaper, he stepped into the backyard with the toolbox in hand. The fence had been leaning. He wanted to fix it before it became a real problem. He never saw the patch of uneven ground. His right leg buckled without warning. The pain was sharp, electric. His vision narrowed as he fell. He landed with a thud, breath knocked clean from his chest. Dorothy found him minutes later, flat on his back, one hand gripping the fence post like a drowning man. "Frank?" He waved her off. "I'm fine. You're pale, just got the wind knocked out of me. You can't stand. It'll pass." "Frank, we're going to the hospital." "No, absolutely not." But Dorothy wasn't asking, and that's how Frank Washington, father, husband, self-declared handyman, and the most stubborn man west of the Mississippi, ended up in room 4B at Phoenix. General, surrounded by professionals who had no idea what to make of the man, who had carried an impossible wound for 3 decades without saying a word. And now, as doctors scrambled, nurses whispered, and the CDC was being called, Frank lay on a sterile table, half-conscious, wondering if he had finally run out of time, because something was wrong, not just with the leg, with everything. And for the first time in 30 years, Frank Washington was afraid. Frank Washington woke every morning at exactly 5:30 a.m., not because he needed to. He had been retired for years, but because he believed a man should rise with the sun, even if the world no longer expected anything from him. The coffee machine in the kitchen sputtered to life with a familiar groan. Frank didn't bother measuring the grounds. He knew the exact weight by feel. Dark roast, no cream, no sugar, strong enough to unclog an engine. He poured a full mug, nodded once to himself, and shuffled toward the living room. The way he walked, deliberate, heavy on his left side, was like someone carrying an invisible sack over one shoulder. His right leg, the one wrapped in layers of secrets, moved just enough to keep balance. The leather recliner by the window creaked under his weight. The Arizona Republic waited on the side table, folded neatly the way Dorothy left it every morning. She had stopped subscribing years ago, but Frank insisted on the physical paper. He trusted ink more than screens. Outside, the neighborhood yawned awake. Retired couples watered their front lawns. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere, a sprinkler clicked into motion. The Washingtons' home sat in a quiet suburb east of Phoenix where the houses looked nearly identical. Tan stucco, low roofs, modest porches. Theirs had an American flag on the front, sun-bleached and fluttering. Frank had raised it every morning for 30 years, even on days his legs screamed at him. Dorothy once asked why he bothered. He'd shrugged. Habit. The silence in the house was comfortable but thick. Dorothy, in her worn robe, moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency. She didn't speak unless necessary. After 45 years, words weren't always needed. She could tell how Frank was feeling by the way he stirred his coffee. Today, he was quiet, more than usual. From the hallway, a soft radio played old country classics. Johnny Cash, Loretta Lynn, the soundtrack of their youth. Dorothy wiped the counter slowly, watching Frank through the corner of her eye. She had noticed it again, how he sat with his legs slightly extended. How he reached for the remote with a grunt that wasn't just age. For years, she had told herself it was arthritis, or perhaps nerve damage from the war. He never said much about it, never corrected anyone who assumed the limp was a battlefield souvenir. And Dorothy never pressed. She remembered the way people looked at Frank during parades, Veterans Day ceremonies, church events. Men shook his hand. Women baked pies. Children stared with admiration. Frank never bragged. That was part of the mystique. He was humble, stoic, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked, who listened more. Then he spoke, who could make a broken lawnmower purr like a kitten. But beneath all that quiet strength, Dorothy had always felt the weight of something unsaid. She had tried once, during their 30th anniversary dinner. They were sitting at a small Italian place downtown. Samuel had paid for the meal. Frank had grumbled about the cost. The candlelight had made him look softer, more tired. "Frank," she had said then, "do you ever think about talking to someone? About the past?" He had put down his fork, met her eyes across the table, and said simply, "No." So she had never asked again. Now, all these years later, the silence between them felt less like comfort and more like a wall. Dorothy turned off the radio and stepped outside to water the front garden. The rose bushes she had planted last spring were struggling in the heat. She knelt, knees cracking, and pressed her palm into the warm earth. Betty Henderson, their 75-year-old neighbor, waved from next door. Dressed in her usual housecoat and sun visor, Betty was already sweeping her porch. She moved like someone half her age, fueled by coffee, routine, and a lifetime of not taking nonsense from anyone. "Morning, Dorothy," she called. "Morning, Betty." Betty leaned on her broom, looking toward the Washington house. "Frank up?" "Of course. He's been up since the birds." Betty smirked. "That man hasn't slept past sunrise since Reagan was in office." Dorothy chuckled, though it didn't reach her eyes. Betty noticed. She always noticed. Back inside, Frank sat in the garage, his sanctuary. It smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and quiet defiance. The old workbench sagged under the weight of half-finished projects, wooden birdhouses, rusted hinges, a disassembled carburetor. The centerpiece was his pride and frustration, a 1987 Chevy pickup that hadn't run in 3 years. He told people he was getting around to it. The truth was, he worked on it when his leg let him, which was less and less often these days. He reached under the truck, grunting, tools clanging softly. Sweat formed under his flannel collar. This place, this garage, was where Frank felt most like himself. Out here, he didn't have to pretend. He didn't have to answer questions. He could disappear into bolts and sockets, and the hum of a box fan pushing hot air toward the open door. He didn't hear Dorothy re-enter the house. He didn't hear the phone ring. Dorothy answered on the third try. It was Samuel. "Hi, Mom." She smiled at the sound of her son's voice. "You're calling early. I got your message last night. Everything okay?" Dorothy hesitated. "Frank fell yesterday. In the backyard." There was a pause. "Is he all right?" "He says he is, but—" "Sam, he couldn't get up. He looked gray." "I'm worried. I'll come this weekend." "No," she said quickly. "Can you come today?" Another pause. "I'll move some things around. Be there in a few hours." Dorothy exhaled. "Thank you, sweetheart." Samuel Washington, 42, lived 2 hours away in downtown Phoenix. A rising star in cardiology, recently divorced, childless, and married to his pager. He hadn't visited his parents in weeks, months maybe. He loved them, but life had a way of getting away from him. Still, hearing the worry in his mother's voice shook something loose. As he packed a go-bag, he texted Emma, his ex-wife, "Emergency at my parents'. Can you meet me there?" Emma, an ICU nurse with a sharp mind and a softer heart, replied instantly. Of course, she knew better than anyone what that family had been silently carrying for decades. The autumn sun cast a muted glow across the Washingtons' backyard, filtering through the fading mesquite tree near the rear fence. The air smelled of dry earth and something faintly metallic, like rust clinging to the wind. Frank had only meant to fix a post. The wooden slat had come loose again, leaning just enough to irritate him every time he glanced out the window. He didn't like things leaning. A man should fix what he could reach. That was the code he lived by. He'd carried his toolbox in his left hand, careful to balance his weight. The limp was sharper than usual that morning, but he ignored it. He always did. He knelt slowly beside the fence, one knee grinding into the dirt. The sun pressed against his neck, sweat gathering beneath his collar. With a sigh, he reached for a rusted wrench and adjusted the tension on the bolt, jaw clenched tight. Then, the ground shifted beneath him. It wasn't an earthquake, or even a particularly soft patch of soil. It was his leg, the right one. It buckled without warning. A jolt of pain, white-hot like electricity, shot up his spine. His vision blurred, his breath caught. Frank collapsed sideways, hitting the earth with a grunt. The world tilted, the sky dipping in and out of focus as he tried to sit up. He couldn't. His right leg refused to cooperate. He pressed his palm to the side of his thigh. It was hot, throbbing, alien. "God damn it," he muttered. From inside the house, Dorothy folded the last of the dish towels and turned toward the window. She squinted, her heart dropping into her stomach. "Frank?" He didn't answer. She rushed outside, her slippers slipping slightly in the gravel path. He was sprawled near the fence, face pale, shirt clinging with sweat. "I'm fine," he mumbled. Before she could say a word, "You're not fine. Frank, look at me." He tried to sit up again and failed. His lips were turning gray. "I just need a second." "It's the heat." Dorothy kneeled beside him, tears pricking her eyes. "I'm calling Samuel." "No." His voice was forceful, almost panicked. "Don't make a scene. You fell. You can't stand. This is a scene, Frank." "I said I'm fine." "You're not." They stared at each other, husband and wife, 45 years of stubborn love between them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Frank reached for the fence post and tried to pull himself upright. His body trembled. He got halfway up before he crumpled again. Dorothy's voice broke. "Frank, please. Let me call him." He didn't answer this time. 2 hours later, a silver hybrid rolled into the driveway at a speed that pushed the neighborhood's speed limit. Samuel stepped out, white coat forgotten, tie loosened, his jaw tight with worry. Emma arrived moments after, parking behind him. The front door creaked open before they knocked. Dorothy stood there, pale and visibly shaken. "He's in the garage. Won't come inside." Samuel moved past her without a word. Emma gave Dorothy a quick, reassuring squeeze before following. Inside the garage, Frank sat at his workbench, his back hunched, staring at a pile of socket wrenches like they might rearrange themselves into answers. A small fan whirred in the corner. The room smelled like motor oil and heat. "Dad," Samuel called gently. Frank didn't look up. "Your mother overreacted. She said you collapsed." Frank grunted. "Tripped. Nothing more." Emma stepped forward, her nurse's instincts instantly reading the scene. The tension in his shoulders, the unnatural angle of his leg, the tightness in his voice. "Frank, can I take a quick look?" Just to put Dorothy's mind at ease. "I said I'm fine." Samuel crossed the room. "Dad, please." Frank slowly turned. His face was chalky, sheen with sweat. His eyes, usually so steady, were flickering with something Samuel hadn't seen since childhood. "Fear. Back in my day," Frank muttered. "We didn't run crying to doctors every time we got a bruise." Samuel crouched next to him, putting a hand on his father's shoulder. "This isn't a bruise. You couldn't get up. That's not normal." Frank opened his mouth to argue, then winced. His hand drifted toward his thigh, as if to cradle the wound he wouldn't name. Emma knelt beside them. "Frank, I'm not here to interrogate you, but you're pale, sweating, guarding that leg like it's broken. I didn't break anything, then let me help prove that." Frank stared at the tools on his bench for a long moment. Then he whispered, "Some things a man carries alone." Emma's voice softened, "And sometimes carrying them too long is what makes them unbearable." He blinked. His hand trembled slightly as he set down the wrench. He didn't speak again. Together, Samuel and Emma helped him to his feet. He leaned heavily on them, jaw clenched. Dorothy appeared at the garage door, her eyes wide with a mix of relief and guilt. "He's going," Samuel said quietly. "Thank God." As they helped Frank into the back seat of Samuel's car, Emma glanced at his leg. Even through the pant leg, she could see the swelling. There was something unnatural in the shape, something that didn't match any injury she had ever seen. She exchanged a glance with Samuel, who saw it too. Frank closed his eyes as the car pulled away from the curb. In the mirror, Betty Henderson stood on her porch, broom paused mid-sweep, watching them go. She knew something had shifted. The fluorescent lights in the emergency wing of Phoenix General flickered, faintly, casting pale blue hues across the linoleum floor. Frank Washington sat slumped in a wheelchair, lips pressed into a thin line, jaw clenched like a rusted vise. He hated hospitals. The smell of antiseptic, the echo of carts and distant monitors, the endless paperwork. It all reminded him of things he'd tried hard to forget. He hadn't been in a hospital bed in over 30 years, and even now, sitting in the waiting area, he looked more like a man awaiting trial than a man needing help. Samuel leaned against the check-in counter, flipping through the paperwork. He'd filled in most of the forms for his father, but there were blanks, deliberate ones. Military service? The intake nurse asked gently, pen poised above the clipboard. Frank didn't look up. Vietnam. 72. Dorothy looked at him, startled. He'd never given a year before. The nurse nodded and jotted it down, unaware of the tremor that passed between the couple. Samuel didn't say anything, but Emma glanced at him, eyebrows raised. A nurse appeared with a clipboard and called Frank's name. He grunted. Let's get this circus over with. Inside the examination room, the air felt colder. The nurse took vitals, blood pressure elevated, heart rate erratic. The swelling in his leg was now visible through his pant leg, stretching the fabric tight across his thigh. Dr. Patricia Martinez entered minutes later, tall, composed, with sharp eyes and a reputation for being relentless with mystery cases. She had seen Frank's name on the patient log and cleared her schedule. Something about the preliminary notes didn't sit right. Mr. Washington, she said, pulling up a stool. I hear you gave your family quite the scare. I tripped, Frank muttered. Twisted ankle? No. Leg gave out. It happens sometimes. That's not normal for a healthy 72-year-old. Frank offered a weak smirk. I'm not exactly in my prime, Dorothy spoke softly from the corner. He's had trouble with that leg for years. Dr. Martinez turned to her. How long exactly? Dorothy hesitated. Since before we were married, he always said it was from the war. Martinez made a note and has it worsened recently. Dorothy nodded. He hides it, but yes. Frank shifted uncomfortably. May I examine the leg? Dr. Martinez asked. Frank's eyes darkened. I'd rather not. Sir, if it's a vascular issue or a mass. I said no. There was a long silence. Frank, Dorothy said quietly. Please. He looked at her, saw the fear in her eyes. Not anger, not suspicion, just fear. It softened something in him. Reluctantly, he nodded. You'll need scissors. Martinez raised an eyebrow. It's wrapped. When the doctor cut away the pant leg, she stopped cold. Even through the thick cloth wrapping, the bulge on his thigh looked unnatural, like someone had tried to smuggle a grapefruit under the skin. She reached for the bandage. I need to see. I'll do it, Frank interrupted. With deliberate, almost reverent movements, Frank began to unwind the bandages himself, layer by layer, revealing stained gauze beneath. The room grew quiet. As the final wrap came off, Martinez's breath caught. The wound, if one could call it that, was unlike anything she had seen. It wasn't open. It wasn't bleeding. It was sealed. The skin over the thigh had formed into what looked like layers of fibrous tissue. Organic, but unnatural. There were subtle ridges, like the rings inside a tree trunk. And embedded within, faintly visible beneath translucent skin, were vessels. Not veins. Not arteries. Something else. Dorothy gasped softly. Emma covered her mouth. Samuel stepped closer, eyes narrowing in disbelief. What in the hell? Martinez whispered. Frank didn't look at them. He stared at the floor, breathing evenly. This isn't necrosis, she murmured. It's structured. Emma leaned in. Is it some kind of parasite? Foreign body reaction? No, Martinez said. This is integrated. His body didn't reject it. It's sustaining it. She turned to Frank. How long have you had this? He didn't answer. Frank, Samuel said, voice cracking. Dad, how long? Frank looked up slowly. Since 1975. Dorothy reeled back as if slapped. That's not what you said before. You said 72. Frank closed his eyes. I lied. The room froze. Why? Samuel's voice was sharp. Why lie? Frank opened his eyes and looked at his son. Because if I told the truth, none of you would have believed me. Martinez sat back. Mr. Washington, whatever this is, it's not standard trauma. If this has been with you for nearly 50 years, it has, Frank said. I've kept it under control. I monitor it. I record changes. You what? Samuel interrupted. You've been treating this yourself? Frank's voice rose. No one else could. No one else should. Dorothy's hands trembled. All these years I thought it was war. Frank turned to her. Let it be that. That's easier. But it's not true, is it? She whispered. Frank didn't respond. Martinez stood. Mr. Washington, I'm ordering a full scan, blood work, biopsy. We're going to figure out what this is. Frank leaned back in the bed. It won't help. Why not? He looked her dead in the eyes. Because I already know what it is. And? Frank's voice dropped to a whisper. It's not supposed to be in me. 2 days after the initial scan, Frank's name appeared in a local news segment. It wasn't a full story, just a teaser. Mystery wound shocks doctors. Vietnam vet may be hiding more than scars. The news anchor's voice was casual, but the image flashed behind her told a different story. A grainy shot of Frank being wheeled into Phoenix General, his face turned away from the camera. That night, the doorbell rang 4 times before Dorothy opened it. A young reporter stood on the porch, hair slicked back, holding a small voice recorder, and flanked by a cameraman whose lens was already recording. Mrs. Washington, I'm with Channel 4. We were hoping to speak to your husband about his military service. About the leg. Dorothy stared at them for a moment, stunned. We're not interested, she said, and shut the door. Inside, Frank stood near the window, curtain pulled slightly back. He'd seen them coming from halfway down the street. This is bad, he said. We need to make them go away. You can't just make reporters disappear, Dorothy replied, her voice sharp, especially not when you've spent your whole life feeding them a lie. Frank flinched. I never asked anyone to report anything. I didn't tell the hospital anything. They assumed. Dorothy turned toward him, arms crossed. And you just let them. Again. It doesn't matter, he said. It's not their business. It's mine, she snapped. It always was. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet in the room was no longer peaceful. It was loaded, like a gun waiting to go off. Frank sat heavily on the armrest of the couch, shoulders hunched. I didn't mean for this to happen. But it did, she replied. And you still won't tell me what's real. Frank looked up, eyes tired. You want the truth? Dorothy didn't answer. I don't know what the truth is anymore, he said quietly. The following morning, the story had spread. A viral clip surfaced online, 2 minutes of speculation, stitched together with hospital security footage and an over-eager voiceover narrating the mysterious case of the aging Vietnam vet with the impossible wound. Betty Henderson arrived on their doorstep with a casserole and concern in equal measure. Sweetheart, she said to Dorothy in a low voice, is he really okay? I mean, is this all true? The war? The leg? Dorothy forced a smile. We're figuring it out. Betty squeezed her hand. You let me know if you need anything. I'm just over the fence. Inside, Frank paced the kitchen like a man on parole. Every time a car passed, he peeked through the blinds. He had disconnected the landline, turned off the TV, refused visitors, but there was no locking the world out now. Samuel drove back down the next afternoon, parking in the same driveway he had so many times before. This time, he didn't feel like a son visiting his parents. He felt like a man chasing a question. Dorothy met him at the door. He's not doing well. I saw the clip, Samuel said. He's all over the internet. Dorothy's voice lowered. And now he won't speak to me. Samuel nodded. Maybe he'll talk to me. Frank was in the garage again, surrounded by his unfinished work. The Chevy still sat silent, untouched since the fall. He didn't look up when Samuel entered. Dad, nothing. Samuel pulled up a folding chair and sat across from him. I'm not here to fight. Frank finally met his eyes. Then what are you here for? I want to understand. What happened to you? What is this thing on your leg? Why lie about Vietnam? Frank exhaled slowly. I didn't lie. Samuel tilted his head. You didn't serve, Dad. I checked. Frank flinched. I pulled military records, searched every Frank Washington born between 1945 and 1950. There's no record of you, no enlistment, no draft, nothing. I didn't get drafted, Frank said. You said you volunteered. I didn't go to Vietnam. Samuel stared. Then why pretend? Frank looked away. I needed a reason, he said. For the limp, for the pain, for what started happening to me. You could have just told the truth. No one would have believed it. Samuel's voice rose. I'm a doctor, Dad. You could have come to me. I didn't want you to see me like this. Samuel stood, hands shaking. You're my father. I needed to know you, not just the version you made up. Frank said nothing. Emma entered then, holding a folder. I went through his medical notes, she said. All those handwritten pages in the garage. She looked at Frank. You've been documenting everything. Growth rates, pain cycles, tissue changes. You recorded the first shift in 1975. Frank didn't deny it. You knew this thing was evolving. Yes. Emma's voice was calm but firm. So what happened in 1975? Frank opened his mouth, then closed it. His shoulders slumped. I signed something, he said finally. A paper, an agreement, and I was told never to speak about it. Dorothy entered then. She had heard every word. What kind of agreement? Frank didn't meet her eyes. A non-disclosure, legal, binding. They paid me to stay quiet. Dorothy's breath caught. Samuel's voice was low. Who did? Frank swallowed. Consolidated Chemical. There was silence. Emma looked confused. That company went bankrupt in the 80s. They offered a settlement, Frank said. After the accident, told me if I ever spoke, they'd sue me into the ground. Said it was a containment breach, that it wasn't supposed to happen. Dorothy's voice cracked. So, you were never in the war? Frank finally looked at her. No. She turned away, her hands trembling. You let me believe that for 45 years, she whispered. I built our life around that lie. I didn't want to lie, Frank said. I wanted to protect you. From what? From the truth, that your husband is something he doesn't understand. She didn't respond, just walked out the door, leaving Frank alone with the silence he had once found comforting. It didn't feel that way anymore. The house was quiet again. Not the comforting kind of quiet Frank used to enjoy. The gentle hum of the fridge, the soft creak of the ceiling fan, Dorothy humming Patsy Cline while folding laundry. This silence was different, hollow, accusing. Dorothy had left the night before, with just a duffel bag and her Bible. She hadn't said goodbye. Frank didn't try to stop her. Now he sat at the kitchen table, the same spot he'd occupied for decades, staring at the mug of coffee he hadn't touched. It had gone cold an hour ago, but he didn't have the energy to get up. The sunlight filtered through the blinds in narrow slats, striping his hands like prison bars. Outside, reporters still loitered by the edge of the lawn. They didn't knock anymore, but they waited. Buzzards in polo shirts. Frank hadn't spoken to Samuel since the argument. Emma had texted once, thinking of you. Call me if you need anything. He hadn't replied. He didn't deserve comfort. Not now. The house echoed with memory. Every corner a monument to a lie. The framed photo of him and Dorothy at Lake Havasu. He in uniform, borrowed from a cousin for the picture. The medals in the box above the fireplace, bought at a pawn shop in 1981. Every detail had been constructed with care, with shame. He'd built the myth brick by brick because the truth was unbearable. But now the bricks were crumbling. He closed his eyes, and the memory came. The air smelled like burning plastic and something sweet, chemical. The year was 1975, and Frank was 23, working. The late shift at Consolidated Chemicals' secondary processing plant. It was supposed to be routine, check the containment gauges, tighten a valve, clock out by midnight. He hadn't gone to Vietnam. He'd failed the physical due to his asthma, though he never told anyone that. When he came home, people assumed he'd served. He let them believe it. It was easier. That night, he was the only technician on floor 3B. The reactor alarms had been disabled for weeks. Budget cuts, they said. Temporary. Frank was tightening a pressure valve when it happened. A hiss. Then a crack, sharp, metallic, and final. The container split down the side like a wound. A burst of pale mist escaped, covering Frank in seconds. It didn't burn. It didn't hurt, but it smelled like sugar and gasoline, and it clung to his skin like fog. He screamed for help, but no one heard. By the time the emergency lights came on, it was too late. They found him coughing blood in the decontamination chamber. His skin was pale, but he was conscious, alert. He kept insisting he was fine. They ran tests for hours. When the results came back, no one had answers. His vitals were stable, no infection, no burns, just something off. A week later, a man in a gray suit visited him in the hospital. Frank never got his name. We're handling this internally, the man had said. We'll cover your medical bills. You'll receive a settlement. In return, you'll never speak of this again. Frank had looked him in the eye and asked, "What happened to me?" The man had smiled. "You survived." Frank had signed the papers that night. $50,000. Lifetime insurance, full silence. At the time, he thought it was a good deal. He could buy a ring for Dorothy, start fresh, move away from the plant, from the town, from the questions. He didn't know the wound would grow, didn't know it would change. He thought it was over, but it never really ended. Back in the kitchen, Frank reached for the yellowing notebook from the garage. His record. Page after page of sketches, diagrams, symptoms. He flipped to the earliest entry, day 2, tingling in thigh, slight discoloration, skin tight but no pain. He turned to the next, week 3, pattern forming, tissue harder, not spreading. Another, year 1, mass feels responsive, pressure triggers pulse, no infection, no rejection. He had documented it like a scientist, desperate to understand the thing inside him, desperate to believe he could control it, that it wouldn't take over. He'd even given it a name in the margins once, though he'd scratched it out later, the root. Frank ran a hand through his hair. His reflection in the kitchen window looked like a stranger, gaunt, worn, hollowed out. He thought of Dorothy's eyes as she walked out. He thought of Samuel's voice cracking as he said, "I needed to know you." He had tried to protect them. He had believed that ignorance was kindness. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe it had never been true. That night, he sat on the edge of the bed they once shared and stared at the empty pillow beside him. The house creaked in the dark. A dog barked 2 blocks over. He reached under the bed and pulled out the box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were the photos. Real ones. A young Frank in a hazmat suit. The old consolidated badge. A black and white image of the cracked container, time-stamped and filed under internal incident, CC to 3B leak. He held one picture in his hands for a long time. It showed him lying in the containment chamber, skin still covered in mist, his eyes wide, awake, alive. He was never supposed to survive that night, but he did, and he had no idea why. The first name Emma found was buried in a government archive. Richard L. Foy, former safety compliance officer, Consolidated Chemical Corporation, 1970 to 1976. No online presence, no phone number, just a paper trail, an outdated pension file, and a single reference in a 1983 environmental lawsuit that had been quietly dismissed. Emma and Samuel sat side by side at her laptop, eyes locked on the same grainy document. "He was there the night of the breach," she said. Filed the incident report himself. It was sealed 6 days later. Samuel leaned in and sealed tight. "Look at this. Redacted lines, missing page numbers. That's not just corporate protocol. That's government silence." "Which means there's more," Emma said. Samuel exhaled. "We need to find him." They spent 2 hours following digital breadcrumbs, real estate databases, property tax records, even church bulletins. Finally, a break. "Richard Foy," Emma read aloud, "now listed under private home care in Wickenburg, rural Arizona. Lives alone, no next of kin." Samuel grabbed his keys. An hour later, they were driving through the desert, red clay roads stretching toward low hills under a burning sky, the kind of landscape where secrets like to settle and grow roots. Meanwhile, back at home, Frank sat in his recliner, still and alert. His coffee sat untouched again. But it wasn't the reporters or the silence of the house that had him rattled. It was his body. He could feel it, something, shifting under his skin. It wasn't pain, not in the usual sense. It was awareness, as if there were nerves now where none existed before, as if his right leg had become its own organ, something alive, thinking, listening. He touched the side of his thigh. A faint pulse answered. Not his heartbeat. Something else. He blinked and pulled his hand away. That night the dreams returned, except they weren't dreams, not fully. In them he stood in the chemical plant again. Same steel corridors, same green exit signs, but this time the corridors stretched longer than physics allowed. The lights flickered in pulses, white, red, green, rhythmic, like a code. There were voices in the vents, low, mechanical, and through the metal walls something moved. Woke. Frank gasped awake, drenched in sweat. The house around him groaned, settling as desert homes often did, but he felt it in his bones. The dream hadn't been random. It had been a message. At dawn, he stepped out onto the porch for the first time in days. The air was sharp and dry. No reporters today. The silence outside was vast. He looked at the horizon, and for the first time, he felt something tugging at him. Not fear, but a kind of gravitational pull. A quiet understanding that this thing inside him wasn't done. It was preparing. The small house on the edge of Wickenburg smelled like wood smoke and mothballs. Emma knocked softly while Samuel scanned the quiet yard. The door opened after a minute. An old man stood there, skin weathered like old leather, eyes sharp behind bifocals. "You're not from the church," he said. "We're not," Emma replied gently. "Are you Richard Foy?" The man didn't answer right away, just studied them, then opened the door wider. "Come in." The living room was dimly lit and full of paper. Stacks of files, boxes of manila folders, even a Rolodex older than either of them. A cat slept on the radiator. A faded U.S. Navy flag hung over the fireplace. "I knew someone would come eventually," Richard said, as he lowered himself into a recliner. Samuel leaned forward. "You filed an incident report in March of 1975. Consolidated Chemical. Plant 3 billions. Richard's lips twitched. "You the press?" "We're family." Emma said he was exposed that night. Richard went still. "Frank Washington." He let the name hang in the air for a few seconds before nodding. "Still alive?" he asked. Samuel nodded. "God help him," Richard whispered. For the next 20 minutes, the room was filled with more truth than any court had ever heard. Richard told them what had really happened that night, how the container that burst wasn't carrying fertilizer compound as the company claimed, but something else, a prototype bioagent, synthetic and reactive, designed for agricultural resilience, the ability to embed in plants, repair damaged tissue. Self-replicating, self-regulating, but it had never been tested on mammals. Frank had been the only one exposed. "They shut it down within a week," Richard said. "Sent in the feds, NDAs all around. I took early retirement. They paid me to disappear." "And Frank?" Emma asked. "They watched him for 6 months. Then stopped. Wrote him off." Samuel was shaking. "You knew he was alive and never checked on him?" Richard looked him dead in the eye. "I was told if I ever did, I'd be arrested. Or worse." Emma pulled out her phone, showing him a photo. "He's changing. His leg, his body. It's not human tissue anymore." "I believe you," Richard said, "because it wasn't meant to stay human." That night, back in Phoenix, Samuel stood outside his father's garage. The door was open. Frank sat inside, staring at his notes by lamplight. Samuel didn't speak at first. "Then, I met Richard Foy." Frank looked up slowly. Samuel walked in, quiet, measured. He sat on the stool across from his father. "He told us everything." Frank nodded once. "I'm sorry," Samuel said. Frank blinked. "For what?" "For being angry, for not asking sooner, for being your son and not understanding what you've been carrying." Frank's voice was rough. "I didn't want you to carry it." They sat there in silence for a long time. No apologies, no lectures, just a father and son, surrounded by rusted tools, old blueprints, and a secret too heavy for one man to hold alone. Frank stood in the bathroom, staring at his reflection. The light above the mirror flickered, washing his face in sickly yellow. He barely recognized the man looking back. His right eye was bloodshot, but not from fatigue. The veins beneath the skin around it had taken on a bluish tint, spreading toward his temple like frost on glass. His cheek twitched involuntarily. He lifted his shirt. The change was no longer confined to his leg. A branching network of raised tissue had begun to spread across his torso, tracing his ribcage like roots pushing under the bark of a dying tree. He pressed a fingertip to one of the ridges. It pulsed, not in sync with his heartbeat. Slower, deeper, like something old waking from beneath the ground. His knees buckled. He caught himself against the sink, breathing hard. Sweat poured from his forehead. For a moment, he felt like he was outside himself, like watching a stranger wear his skin. Then came the voice, not a sound exactly, a presence. "We are not broken." Frank gasped. The words had no echo, no origin. They weren't spoken aloud, yet they existed, vibrating somewhere just behind his thoughts. "We are not broken." He stumbled back into the hallway, slamming the bathroom door behind him. His hands shook as he gripped the wall, heart pounding. He closed his eyes, willing the sensation away. But it lingered. It always lingered. Across town, Emma stared at her laptop screen in disbelief. The lab results had come back hours earlier. She'd sent them to a friend in genetic pathology at a private research center. No names, no explanations. Just a request for a full sequencing of the tissue sample she'd discreetly collected from Frank's wound during one of his hospital visits. Now the data scrolled in front of her, rows of irregularities and warning flags. One line stood out. Unidentified nucleotide structure. Partial match to Homo sapiens. 76%, remaining 24%, unknown classification. She sat back in her chair, goosebumps crawling up her arms. Unknown classification, not mutation, not cancer, not infection, something else. She printed the report, locked it in a folder, and slid it into her satchel. This wasn't just about a sick man anymore. This was about biology rewriting itself. At 10:12 p.m., a black SUV parked down the street from Frank's house. Inside, 2 men sat in silence. They wore civilian clothes, but their posture, clipped radios, and military-grade comms belied their true nature. One held a file marked CC3B residual bioasset, status, active. The man in the passenger seat tapped his earpiece. Subject appears agitated, biological fluctuations increasing, requesting permission to initiate phase 1 contact. A voice crackled back through static, negative. Hold position, no direct engagement unless containment is compromised. The man nodded. Copy that. He closed the file. On the last page was a photo of Frank Washington, taken 2 days ago. Meanwhile, Samuel sat beside his father in the garage. The silence between them had grown more natural in the past day. Less strained, like something had shifted between them. Something more honest. Frank sat with a heating pad wrapped around his leg, flipping through his old notebook. His fingers lingered on one page, an early drawing of the wound from 1982. Back then, it had been small, almost beautiful, like coral forming beneath the skin. Emma got results, Samuel said quietly. The sample you let her take? Frank didn't look up. Let me guess. It's not mine. Not entirely. Frank closed the notebook. There's something inside you, Samuel continued. Something intelligent. Frank finally turned his gaze to him. You think it's conscious? I think it's communicating. Frank looked away. It's not new. Samuel straightened. What do you mean? I started hearing it 5 years after the accident. Not voices, not at first, just instincts, urges I couldn't explain, things I knew but had never learned, muscle memory in places I never trained. He flexed his fingers unconsciously. Then came the dreams, the visions. Why didn't you say anything? Because the moment you admit you're hearing voices, they stop listening to anything else. Samuel's jaw tightened, and now, Frank was quiet for a long time. It's louder, he said finally. It doesn't want to hide anymore. At 3 a.m., Frank couldn't sleep. He stood barefoot in the backyard, the desert wind whispering across his skin. The moon was low, pale and quiet. The world felt like it was holding its breath. He looked down at his arm. The tissue beneath the skin was shifting again, not randomly, patterning. It moved like vines weaving themselves into form, slow, steady, with purpose. We are remembering. The voice again. He felt a weight press against the edge of his mind. Not pain, memory, but not his. A planet, not Earth, a species, not human. A moment, shattering containment, time folding in on itself. Frank staggered back, grabbing the railing of the deck. His knees hit the ground. He gasped as the memory flooded in, not a flashback, but an imprint, a sensation of being spread across space, of surviving extinction, of merging with something smaller in order to continue. He choked on his breath. For a heartbeat, he saw his own body from the outside. Then it was gone. The next morning, Emma returned with the folder. She handed it to Frank without a word. He opened it slowly. Read. Closed it. No reaction. Do you understand what this means? She asked. Frank nodded. I do now. What is it? Frank looked out the window. It's not a disease, he said. It's a memory. The transformation was no longer gradual. It accelerated. Frank woke with his skin slick with sweat, his muscles twitching involuntarily. His right arm no longer felt like his own. The texture had changed, smooth, dense, almost rubber-like beneath the skin. The veins had deepened in color, taking on a dark blue hue, and his fingertips buzzed with a faint current. He couldn't feel cold anymore. Or heat, only pressure, only pulse. His reflection showed a man who was no longer fully human. Something ancient lived in his eyes now, something that remembered more than one lifetime. And still, the voice remained, integration near completion. He didn't resist anymore. In a secure government building outside Tucson, an emergency meeting convened. A black-clad operative laid down a photo on the table. Frank Washington, taken via thermal drone just 2 nights prior. Internal temperature rising above 106 degrees, the agent said. Organ function stable. Subject exhibits cellular adaptation far beyond human tolerance. A woman in a gray suit leaned forward. Is he dangerous? He's unpredictable, the agent replied. And evolving. We believe the foreign tissue is now controlling large portions of his autonomic systems. Viability for recovery? The room went silent. 0, another agent said. Phase 4 protocol recommended. The gray-suited woman tapped the folder in front of her. Authorization to proceed with biological containment and neutralization. If integration completes, we lose all control. A general to her left nodded. Target is high risk, no known weaknesses. Operatives must act before Phase 5 occurs. Understood. They all signed, and back in Phoenix, Samuel was staring at his father's CT scans. What was once clearly a human vascular system had changed. Additional structures now weaved around Frank's spine and internal organs, forming a complex network of filaments and nodes. Some had begun to emit faint bioelectric pulses, synchronized like a heartbeat, but from a different source. This isn't metastasis, Samuel said quietly. It's architecture. Emma sat beside him, silent. You said the DNA had 24% unknown classification, he continued. But what if it's not just unknown? What if it's not of this earth? Emma hesitated. Are you saying it's alien? I'm saying it's intelligent. They both turned as Frank entered the room, slower than usual, but composed. Don't stop talking just because I'm here, he said. Samuel cleared his throat. Dad, this is serious. Your body is changing at a cellular level. You're no longer metabolizing like a human. Your nervous system is splitting, restructuring. I know. Emma stood. We have to make a decision. If we don't alert someone now, they already know, Frank interrupted. What? They've been watching since 1975. They knew the agent was unstable, but they let it leak. I wasn't the only subject, just the only one who survived. Samuel stepped closer. What are they going to do? Frank looked him in the eyes. They're going to kill me. That evening, Dorothy returned. Her voice shook as she stepped inside. I saw the news. They're saying you're a biological threat, that the hospital leaked your scans. Frank didn't deny it. She stepped forward, slowly, unsure whether to touch him. Are you still you? He hesitated, then whispered, I'm more me than I've ever been. Later that night, Frank sat alone in the garage, staring at his old journals. His hand no longer looked human. 4 fingers had fused subtly, forming a more efficient grip. His skin was semi-translucent now under the lamplight. He reached for the page from 1976, the one marked in red. The root wakes he had no memory of writing it. Yet the handwriting was his. He closed his eyes, and the voice returned. We remember extinction. We remember fire. You are the last vessel. What are you? Frank whispered. We are not what. We are when. We are the last thought of a dying star. His breath hitched. Your pain is not punishment. It is evolution. You are not being erased. You are being chosen. Outside, the black SUV from Tucson pulled up in silence. 3 figures emerged, dressed in desert camouflage armor. They moved without sound, weapons holstered but primed. One held a biometric scanner. Another carried a containment syringe the size of a forearm. Inside the house, Emma was the first to hear it. A click, a soft rustle, a shadow across the hallway. She grabbed Samuel's arm. Someone's here. Samuel stepped into the hall. He didn't see the agent until the flashlight blinded him. Hands up. Step away from the subject. Frank appeared in the doorway behind him. The lead agent raised his weapon. Subject Washington. Under Federal Biological Security Protocol 4A, you are ordered to surrender for containment and termination. Frank didn't move. Then, without warning, he stepped forward. The agent fired. The dart struck Frank's chest and melted. The liquid hissed, absorbed into his skin harmlessly. Frank looked up, eyes glowing faintly blue. Too late, he said. His voice was layered now. More than one voice, more than one species, more than one memory. The lights in the house flickered. The walls seemed to hum. From the kitchen, Dorothy screamed. Samuel stepped in front of his father, shielding him. Stop! Emma reached for her phone. We need to record this. Someone has to see what's happening. But it was already beyond documentation. Frank didn't attack. He simply raised one hand. and the agent nearest to him dropped to his knees, clutching his head. "I hear them," he whispered. "I hear everything." The other agents backed out. The mission was compromised. They retreated into the night, and Frank stood still for a long time, then slowly turned to his family. "I'm not going to hurt anyone," he said. "But I can't stop it now." Samuel stepped closer. "Then we help you finish it, on your terms." Frank looked at them, one by one, and nodded. The sun rose quietly over Phoenix the next morning, casting long golden light across the Washington's backyard. Birds chirped without urgency. The desert wind carried dust and silence in equal measure. Frank stood barefoot in the grass, his skin shimmering faintly in the sun. The transformation was complete. He was no longer a man in the biological sense. The tissue that wrapped his body was stronger, adaptive. Beneath it pulsed a new kind of system, a network of organic memory, ancient and non-terrestrial. His eyes glowed faintly blue in the sunlight, not from power, but from remembrance. But his heart, whatever that word meant now, still beat like Frank Washington's. Dorothy stepped beside him and took his hand. His skin felt cooler than it used to, but familiar somehow. "You're still here," she whispered. "I never left," he said. Behind them, Samuel and Emma stood in the doorway, watching, unsure what came next. Frank turned slowly. "We have to tell them." Samuel nodded. "Are you sure?" Frank looked at the horizon. "If I disappear now, they'll chase rumors forever. I'd rather they know the truth than fear a myth." 2 days later, Frank sat down for an interview. Not with a government agency, not with military brass, but with a journalist, independent, unafraid, live streaming to over 2 million viewers in the first hour. He told them everything. The leak in 1975, the corporate silence, the pain, the isolation, the change. He rolled up his sleeve on camera and showed them the network beneath his skin, veins that weren't veins, but conduits of memory. "It's not a disease," he said, voice steady. "It's a preservation. Someone was dying, and it found me." The reporter asked, "Are you still human?" Frank didn't hesitate. "I remember being a man, a father, a liar, a survivor, and I still feel those things. So maybe I'm not human in body anymore. But I am in spirit, and I'm not here to harm anyone." The feed went viral. Within hours, governments responded. One faction wanted containment, another demanded his execution. But millions of others, ordinary people, saw something different: hope. Proof that life could survive the unthinkable, that even the remnants of a forgotten civilization could find shelter in a broken man's body and rebuild something new. That night, Frank sat alone on the roof, the city lights glittering below like stars fallen to earth. Samuel joined him, carrying 2 mugs of tea. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Samuel said, "Do you remember my first bike crash, when I broke my arm?" Frank chuckled. "You swore you were fine, until I touched it." "I was scared," Samuel said, "but not of the pain. I was scared you'd be disappointed in me." Frank looked over, eyes soft. "I never was." "I know," Samuel said, "but I think I finally understand what you were scared of all these years. It wasn't them. It was us." Frank nodded slowly. "I didn't want you to see me as something else." "I don't," Samuel said. "I see you as more." The next day, black helicopters hovered over the Phoenix outskirts. An official convoy approached the Washington home. But they didn't storm the door, because Frank had already left. A letter was found on the kitchen table, handwritten, simple. "To those who choose control over understanding, you are not fighting a monster. You are fearing change. I was never your enemy. I was just what came next." And 3 months passed. Frank's story became legend, conspiracy for some, revelation for others. Scientists debated his biology. Philosophers debated his soul. Preachers quoted his final words as prophecy, but no one ever found him. Some claimed he walked into the desert and vanished. Others said he took to the stars, returning to wherever it came from. But Samuel believed something else, that his father was still walking the earth, not hiding but learning, helping, becoming, and maybe one day, when the world was ready, he'd return, not to warn us, but to invite us forward. In the end, Frank Washington didn't vanish. He transformed into something the world wasn't ready to understand. But maybe, just maybe, he wasn't a warning. Maybe he was a message that even in the ashes of our greatest mistakes, life still finds a way to grow again. What makes us human? Is it our body, our memories, or the choices we make when everything familiar begins to fade? Let us know in the comments. If you were in Frank's place, would you hide, or would you stand and tell the world the truth? And if this story moved you, even a little, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking stories, and share this with someone who still believes in second chances.